grad student at USF working on his PhD in philosophy with a focus on Buddhism, Spinoza, and ecological thoughts. In his spare time, he enjoys taking care of plants and going on adventures with his boyfriend Ray, aka Pickle, and Emma Lou the Husky. I love that you added the nickname Pickle.
It's also the Husky's nickname. So.
Oh, cool. Well, Cameron, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Okay.
And I'll let you take the floor.
All right, so I guess I'll sort of start by tying this into my own story because as a philosopher, or to-be philosopher, I'm not apt to work in stories all that much. So these are kind of the basis of some of the Buddhist discourses, which have a story element to them, much in the way that, say, you might find Jesus teaching the disciples in the New Testament the way that the Buddha would have taught his followers or bhikkhus in the sutra literature. But this, in some ways, I don't know if I would call myself a Buddhist or just a student of Buddhism, in that I, as a young person, was once very religious, coming from a Christian background, and was rather, perhaps a little bit too intense in my devotion to it, to the point that it seemed to kind of fall apart upon really close scrutiny, because I was always scrutinizing different ideas and thoughts, and my religious commitments didn't hold up to my own scrutiny after a while, and it led me in different directions and exploring different types of ideas. And so I had the luxury, I guess you could say, of studying Chinese and South Asian thought as an undergraduate, and it led me now to kind of focus at least part of my studies on Buddhism in the larger context of philosophical thought generally. So I do have a belief that there are aspects of Buddhist thinking that can help us deal with contemporary issues, despite the very ancient, how ancient these teachings will be. So what I want to talk about today is really just going to be, if you know much about Buddhism, this might sound repetitive, but in any case, I did realize, because I wanted to talk about some things that are perhaps really, really basic to the early teachings of Buddhism, that I might have shed a bit of a dark side of Buddhism. I mean, not have shed much light, but shed a little bit of darkness on Buddhism, because it's often accused of being a dark or pessimistic religion. But maybe we can have some discussion that kind of brings out something that looks past that supposed pessimism and looks at some of the positive contributions we make, either learning from it or from practicing it. So we'll see. So I'm actually, this isn't so much a story or discourse I've memorized. I will read this one discourse because it's particularly short, and my sense is that it kind of reveals the core of a really pivotal concept of Buddhism in general. We'll see kind of where that takes us. So I don't know if I'll need to write any vocabulary down, but we'll see. I might aid you with some words just to keep us on track here. But this is a fairly short discourse, so we'll see what comes of it. And so this is called the Discourse to Kachayana, or the Kachayana Gota Sutta. And so being a sutta, these are, in a sense, stories of the direct teachings the Buddha gave. So these constitute the scriptural basis, at least in the Pali Canon. These are taken as authoritative words of the Buddha. So whether or not these are word for word the things that came from his mouth, these come from the oral teachings of the Buddhist tradition that were carried down and eventually canonized in text. And there's I'm going to read this discourse and then have a little discourse about it. So, dwelling at Savatthi, at the time the Venerable Kachayana approached the Exalted One. So the Exalted One is always the Buddha himself. When he had approached the Exalted One, he greeted him courteously and sat down to one side. When he was seated to one side, the Venerable Kachayana said to the Exalted One, right view, it is said, sir. To what extent is there right view? The world, Kachayana, is for the most part inclined towards two views, existence and non-existence. And these in an absolute sense, absolute existence, absolute non-existence, or nothingness. For the one who sees with right wisdom the arising of the world as it really is, the idea of non-existence in regard to the world does not occur. For the one who sees with right wisdom the ceasing of the world as it really is, the idea of existence in regard to the world does not occur. For the most part, the world is bound by approach, attachment, and inclination. But one who does not follow that approach and attachment, the determination of mind, that inclination and disposition, who does not cling to or adhere to the view, this is myself, who thinks the arising of suffering is what arises, the ceasing of suffering is what ceases. Such a person does not doubt and is not perplexed. Herein, one's knowledge is not dependent on others. To this extent, there is right view. Everything exists, he said. This is one extreme. Everything does not exist. This is the second extreme. Without approaching either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma of the middle. So many of you probably have heard this idea of the middle path or the middle way. Buddhism is sort of striking some type of path in between extremes. This next paragraph is, I take to be particularly important. So it's a little bit tedious. So, dependent on ignorance, there are dispositions to action. Dependent on dispositions to action, there is consciousness. Dependent on consciousness, there is psychophysicality. Dependent on psychophysicality, there are the 6 bases of sense. Dependent on the 6 bases of sense, there is contact. Dependent on contact, there is feeling. Dependent on feeling, there is craving. Dependent on craving, there is attachment. Dependent on attachment, there is becoming. Dependent on becoming, there is birth. Dependent on birth, there is aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, despair, and distress. Thus there is the arising of this whole mass of suffering. So, someone looking at this particular part of the passage would describe this as what's often called the sort of 12-link chain of dependent origination, the sort of Buddhist basic idea of all of the sort of causal connections and relationships that make up the world as we experience it, that make up the constituency of our experience world, with a particularly strong emphasis on the way we as human beings experience that world. And the one culminating concept that ties all of that experience in is translated here in the word that's often used to translate dukkha. Here it's called suffering. And it's not necessarily a bad translation, but it's open to alternative translations in the sense that dukkha, the way I would like to talk about it is that sort of the quality of the experiential world has this sense of an inherent dissatisfaction or dissatisfactoriness. As we'll see in another section I'm going to discuss later, even things that we think of as beneficial or happy or pleasurable are in some ways kind of qualified by this dissatisfactoriness. And simply calling them suffering has a certain connotation in English that I don't think is intended by what the text is giving us. There's something more fundamental and a little less sort of sharp and biting than suffering. So that's another sense in which a lot of discussion surrounding Buddhism makes it sound like this dark and pessimistic and hopeless religion, and it actually constitutes the potential for quite a bit of positivity and hope. And if we perhaps don't use language like outright suffering, we can think of it in a much more productive way. Now, the one last section of this discourse. So, but from the complete cessation, without remainder of ignorance, there is the cessation of the dispositions to action. From the cessation of dispositions to action, there is the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness, there is the cessation of the 6 sense bases. From the cessation of the 6 sense bases, there is the cessation of contact. From the cessation of contact, there's the cessation of feeling. The cessation of feeling, the cessation of craving, the cessation of craving, the cessation of attachment, the cessation of attachment, the cessation of becoming, cessation of becoming, and there's a cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth, there ceases old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, despair, and distress, and thus the sensation of the entire aggregation of dukkha, entire aggregation of this unsatisfactory existence we find ourselves in. This, luckily being a fairly short and concise discourse or sutta, you see that there is this element of repetition. So in the way that, at least in the Pali Canon, in the way that the suttas are written down, they have this kind of repetitive and rhyming nature because this is an oral tradition. It's being taught usually orally, and the idea is not that everybody gets a copy of the book to take home, but that monks and nuns living in a monastery are going to be repeating these things out loud in unison. And this is something that is a part of a long-standing Indian religious tradition. It's not necessarily unique to Buddhism. But this is being committed to memory, and it was supposed to be shared. And so reading this kind of as a contemporary reader, this repetition and this kind of redundancy seems to be just that, redundant, but it has an important religious quality that it aids memorization and also aids the kind of meditative process that would accompany studying these kind of texts and understanding these kind of teachings. And so in this particular discourse, the Buddha has described, given an overview, without too much in the way of metaphysical commitment, given an overview of what constitutes reality as we experience it, and begins to give a hint of the way, at least what the cessation of all these constituents of the world would look like. And the word in Sanskrit nirvana and the Pali nibbana is often, kind of translated as enlightenment or as like pure bliss, but it's the kind of state in which all of these activities and processes have come to an end, and the dissatisfactoriness of existence has itself been terminated or been put to rest. So a slightly better language thinking about that is kind of putting things to rest, calming things down. So it's not exactly enlightenment or bliss on the one hand, but it's not outright termination or cessation on the other. Just thinking of the world of causation and activity as this kind of tumultuous existence which breeds despair and dissatisfaction, and bringing all of that activity to rest and calmness is one way of describing the kind of ultimate religious goal of Buddhism. And some would object that only characterizes some schools of Buddhism and not others, and there's a certain truth to that. But it would seem that the ultimate aim of most schools of Buddhism are going to be something that looks like attaining the status of nibbana, attaining a status of rest for all sentient beings. One thing that marks a difference between this school of Buddhism, which today is mostly characterized by Theravada, the way it differs from other Mahayana schools of Buddhism, is that Mahayana schools have the idea of a bodhisattva, some being who has attained all the qualities of enlightenment but refuses to partake in that full enlightenment because their goal is to also aid the rest of the sentient beings in attaining that same state. And until all sentient beings have also joined along and reached enlightenment, the bodhisattva as an ethical ideal, someone who's a bodhisattva is not going to go to rest themselves until every living, every sentient thing is also able to attain that state with their assistance. So there's definitely some different stages along the way depending on the school of Buddhism you're talking about. Now, another discourse that's going to expand on some of these concepts is a bit longer, and so I want to kind of more or less summarize it in a sense. So it's actually so repetitive that the translator themselves actually left out a lot of the details because it just kind of goes on and on and on. But I'll begin the discourse. I'll sort of begin a discussion kind of its title. And so it's translated in English as the Discourse on the All. And the All in Sanskrit is Sarva and Pali is Sabba. So this is called the Sabba Sutta, the discourse, the Sutta on the All. And the All with the capital L, the Buddha is teaching a group of bhikkhus here, and he's teaching them sort of, once again, kind of this analysis of sorts of what exists, what is reality, how is reality to be understood, what is the way in which, particularly in terms of Buddhist practice, that we should approach understanding reality as it is in itself. And he has a particularly I think, astute way of trying to characterize reality in such a way that will help those that are learning from him how to understand in a way that allows them to attain to a state of enlightenment, to put the sort of constituents of reality to rest, so to speak. And so the Sabbasutta, same location at Savatthi, speaking, this is where the exalted one is right now. He's speaking to a group of bhikkhus, and some of these discourses describe 500 or 1,000 bhikkhus that are following him from place to place. And he shows up with all these bhikkhus, and or some, they often say bhikkhus, there's also bhikkhunis, which are the nuns, the female monks, that sometimes get kind of forgotten about in discussions around Buddhism. But anyways, he's teaching the bhikkhus, and he says, I would teach you the all that exists, listen to me. And what is it that is the all? Like I said, this one can get really repetitive, so I'm going to leave some details out. It's the eye and visible objects, the ear and sounds, the nose and smells, the tongue and tastes, the body and tangible objects, the mind and mental objects. This is what I call the all. And he goes on, sort of, this is just kind of the rundown. So I guess in we Westerners think, whether we're thinking philosophically or scientifically or just in our sort of commonplace understanding of things, and if we were to give an exhaustive description of the things that exist, we would sort of take for granted that we are living beings and there's a world outside of us we experience in some way, and we might give an inventory of the objects that exist. And so the way in which the Buddha and subsequently the sort of philosophical developments that come out of his teaching, there's a very significant status of significant reality that the Buddhist teachings give, not only to sort of the objects of our awareness, but the very fact of our awareness. So here, what we're going to see is that we have our sensory apparatuses, our eye, our nose, our ears, our mind. So, mental consciousness and the ideas that we have, that's considered kind of a first level of mental, of experience, much like our other senses. So it's not only our sensory organ, the object of that sensory organ, but also the contact that those two things make. All of those make up kind of distinct, separate entities, if you will. Those make up different constituents of the reality to kind of extrapolate what in philosophy we call an ontology, just an inventory of all the things that exist. And so he wants to teach the bhikkhus here not just what exists, but what is give them a doctrine for abandoning the all. So once again, we have an outline of what exists, what reality consists of, and the sort of religious or spiritual goal is in some ways detaching or abandoning it altogether. And what is the doctrine for abandoning the all? Only to cover one of the sense spheres here. The eye is to be abandoned, visible objects are to be abandoned, visible consciousness is to be abandoned, eye contact is to be abandoned. Whatever feeling arises from eye contact is to be abandoned. Whether pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that too should be abandoned. So in one sense, he's giving, which is probably consistent with a Western way of thinking about reality, giving a description of how we should understand reality in terms of this exhaustive description of all the entities and objects and details contained therein. But the reason for understanding reality the way it is isn't so much for, say, scientific purposes, this sort of exhaustive understanding of reality for the sake of knowledge, but that understanding the world the way it is a means to our spiritual development and to attaining closer to our spiritual goals in this Buddhist sense. And that and so he goes all the way through all the different sensory apparatus we have and describes how to abandon these contacts and these experiences. And that is that all which, by knowing it directly, by fully understanding it, by developing dispassion towards it, and by forsaking it, we will be able to destroy, once again the translation says suffering, but we will destroy the dissatisfactoriness of our experienced world. To kind of add some I guess, a bit of a burn, a bit of a bite to this teaching about how in this particular case, I want to say he does describe, he's speaking to 1,000 bhikkhus here, to kind of, once you've come to this exhaustive understanding of reality, how to best go about getting a hold of this kind of detachment and this letting go of it. As he says, sort of developing this passion towards it. Once again, seemingly the opposite of what we're supposed to do in the kind of society we live in. Having this passion and disconnection and forsaking things isn't really the way we're taught to think about our experiences in life. And the way in which the Buddha here in this discourse describes what is the sort of attitude you should have towards the all that exists. He says, that is the all which, by knowing it directly, obviously fully understanding and developing this passion for it and forsaking it, you'll be able to destroy suffering. And he says, bhikkhus, think of this all as an all that is burning. What is the all that is burning? So taking the example of the sensation of the eyes here. The eye is burning. Visible objects are burning. Visual consciousness is burning. The eye contact is burning. The feelings that arise from eye contact, pleasant, painful, neither painful nor pleasant, those two are burning. And by what is it that they are burning? They're burning by the fire of lust, by the fire of hatred, by the fire of delusion. Burning, I say, by birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, despair, and distress. And so in this sense, I take it to mean in some sense that this is to illustrate this exhaustive understanding of reality and seeing that our sense experience of the world and our attachment to the things of our sense experience and the feelings that arise from that inform sort of ongoing kind of pattern of attachment, which in the kind of metaphysics of Buddhism, if you will, is actually the basis of the cycles of rebirth we go through. These features, these sort of causes of the ways in which our lived experience and what constitutes reality is in this way burning, to describe it as a burning world, a blazing world, a world consisting of a fire that is kind of fueled by all these negative emotions and negative energies. Has the instructive, is intended to be instructive in a way to overcoming those attachments and overcoming that sort of burning reality, so to speak. So it affords the possibility, as he describes sort of what does the mind of someone who's able to understand, not only understand the all in an exhaustive sense, but to understand the all as burning, to understand the all as burning from hatred and from delusion and from greed. A bhikkhu, in this case, who has actually attained this state of being disillusioned with the senses, one detaches oneself from lust. Being freed from lust, one is liberated, and in a liberated person there is knowledge of such liberation. For such a person knows that birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, done is what was to be done, and that there is nothing further in this present state of existence. Nothing further to be done in this present state of existence. Nothing further to be accomplished. To actually, I suppose, fill out a full description of what, say, attaining to a state of nibbana is actually going to look like for a Buddhist. And in this case, I think a limitation for, say, maybe a lay practitioner's reading of Buddhism is that it's perhaps not directed towards a lay reader, these type of teachings, in the sense that maybe someone who's living the life of a monk or a nun is someone who's closer to actually engaging in an understanding and a practice at this level. So Buddhism, perhaps on one level, isn't saying don't have a life and don't have a partner and don't have a career and don't to take Buddhism, certain fundamental concepts of Buddhism very seriously and very personally might constitute most of us forsaking all of our lives and our motivations altogether. So the ways in which these kind of teachings actually apply to maybe the general population would have significant caveats to them. But it does seem to constitute at some level a description of the very nature, the constituency of what human psychology and what the human contact with the world is like and what constitutes that experience, and the ways in which we should at least perhaps not approach it with the seeming, disdainfulness that one might, in the sense that viewing the all that is burning and fueled by all these negative emotions, but just maybe holding it in a bit of an eye of suspicion towards it, in a sense, and understanding that the sort of cyclical nature of our existence, the causal series of events is kind of motivated by, is subject to constant change, and that holding that in some degree of suspicion, not allowing ourselves to be too deeply attached to it and entrenched in it, will allow us to at least avoid, to some extent, significant degrees of suffering in our life. Whether or not it's actually saying each and every one of us should forego everything and give up everything to attain Nibbana is perhaps not the exact intent of teachings like this. But my hope is that it can, kind of help us think and rehash some of the kind of basic constituent concepts of Buddhism. I will say, to kind of tie this into my more or less, like strictly sort of philosophical research without spending too much time on it, and you let me know when time is up. I don't know exactly how. I'm not thinking in terms of how much more. Okay.
A little bit more time.
Okay, all right. Just to say, kind of a way in which this could be kind of hashed out in philosophical terms from maybe a Western philosophical perspective of kind of taking classical Buddhist concepts and turning them into something supposedly more logical. On the one hand, relies on the Buddhist philosophy's own tradition of describing reality in terms of distinct and discrete dhammas or dharmas. And so, on the one hand, the Buddha is describing a path for life and a sort of set of ethical principles that one follows that constitutes the Dhamma, the general teaching of the Buddha, sometimes thought of as a singular Dhamma and sometimes translated as a capital D. So capital D, singular Dhamma, contrasted to lowercase d, plural Dhamma, or dharmas. That sort of in the last discourse, when we talk about the all and the all that is burning, the sort of minute constituents of all of our sense faculties and all of our sense experiences and all of the contacts between our sense faculties and our experiences and all the feelings that arise therein. Each one of those makes up a single minute constituent of the world that the later sort of Buddhist philosophical tradition calls dhammas. And so, it also underlies the idea that, like pratika samuppada, the dependent co-origination of existence, that the things of this world, ourselves, our bodies, material objects, any of the objects that we would experience in our through our senses, are ultimately made up of minute constituent components, and in that sense, everything is subject to constant ongoing change. Nothing has any substantial reality in it itself because it's an ongoing process of dhammas going in and out of place and changing position, location, and time. And so, in some ways, just giving a description of reality in this way affords the possibility of breaking down the things we experience in life as not worthy of the type of attachment and reification that would constitute feelings that might generate suffering and dissatisfaction from having contact with those things. So we understand them the way that they are. We're understanding them as subject to change because they fundamentally lack their own existence. And so one short kind of description of the way in which this concept is tied to the concept of nirvana by a Russian Buddhist scholar, Stravatsky. The formula of the Buddhist credo, which professedly contains the shortest statement of the essence and spirit of Buddhism, which could be argued the contrary, declares that the Buddha discovered the elements or the dhammas of existence, their causal connection, and a method to suppress their efficiency forever. Vasubandhu makes a similar statement about the essence of the doctrine. It's a method of converting the elements of existence into a condition of rest, out of which they will never emerge again. So I think that's all I really have on that. So